Stitch.
If we'd moved, we would have been on the stage.
Yeah.
Okay, we might just get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Just want to start by thanking Melbourne Free University for having us and hosting us tonight as part of the 4 series seminar. We're up to week 3, which is really good. Well, we've made it this far. That's probably what I meant. I'm thinking of teaching rather still. Just a quick background on MFU. It's a great initiative where it's running courses, usually 6 weeks. We're doing ours in 4. The idea is to exchange ideas, free thinking, free discussion. And there's always that opportunity for everyone to come in and participate. So it seemed like a suitable platform for us. Is the sound all right? Yeah. A bit loud?
No, it's good. No, it's good.
Not loud. Okay. I'll just give you a bit of background while we've got this vegetable oil getting ready.
Bit of a nothing.
I met Miki through an interview while she was doing.
Oh, I don't know. Probably can move it. Oh, yeah. Chairs are a bit. Oops, sorry.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Hello.
Troublemaker, is it?
Yeah, I'm one of these.
So basically, I'll restart by introducing myself. I'm Saba Bebawi, and this is Miki Sosnowski. And as I said, I met Miki while she was doing a program called Melbourne up in Byron Bay. And she interviewed me, and she said she was coming down to Melbourne, and we met, and we obviously connected. And we kind of had the same idea of talking to people and letting people know about the Middle East through kind of personal stories. Now, to be honest, I wasn't on board. I was, I'm an academic. We don't talk about personal stories. We talk about theory and concepts. And then, so it kind of drifted off, and we weren't sure what we were going to do. And then the Gaza-Israel war, that's what you want to call it, happened. And I found myself actively going on Facebook, humanizing the conflict. So putting a lot of images of Palestinian children amongst the rubble in bathtubs, having baths, and showing that, it's not numbers, it's not Hamas, it's not IDF, it's actually people are involved. And so Miki got back to me and said, well, how about we get this reignited? And I said, all right, I actually don't mind the human story aspect anymore. So with that, since I have media experience, I said, well, let's have a media component to it. So we called it Middle East Mediated. And we've asked each of our speakers to bring in a mediated item and talk about the conflict and humanizing the conflict from that. But I think particularly tonight with Palestine-Israel conflict, we're also mediating between the two. This is the first week where we have 2 countries instead of 1 in the title. And I think that's really important because it means that there needs to be mediation between those 2 people. So we have asked our 2 speakers to come today and talk to us from that basis. The format for tonight will be that Miki will be interviewing them, asking each of our speakers questions, Then there's 2 questions that she'll ask each, and then we'll open it to the floor to speak for any questions or comments that you might have. So without further ado, I might just introduce Samah Sabawi, who is a Palestinian, an Australian, and a Canadian, and a writer and a human rights advocate. I'd also like to introduce Eli Glasman, who's a Jewish writer and an author of the novel The Boy's Own Manual to Being a Proper Jew. So please welcome them, and I'll hand it over to Miki.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks to our speakers for coming along, and thank you to all of you for coming along too. There's maybe one more space now. We're going to start with Samah's mediated item, which is going to be projected up onto the screen behind right into Samah's mind. Maybe Samah, you can tell us why you chose this image. Should be alright where it is.
Okay, so you guys can hear me? I don't know if any of you have seen this image on Facebook the last few days. It started to make the rounds. What you're looking at is a figure, or a few figures, I don't know which picture you're looking at, of, let me just look at which one. Yes, okay. So this is done by an artist in Gaza. The figures you're looking at, they're inspired by the people who fled from the Shujaiya massacre. If you were watching the news during the war on Gaza, which is what I would like to call it, you would remember people fleeing from their homes, some of them with blood on them, some of them looking for their loved ones. The reason I picked this image is because I actually had something completely different in mind. Originally, I wanted to use the key, the right of return. But to me, this image is a lot more haunting and a lot more poignant. And it tells the story in a human way, which is what Saba was talking about before. The figures are made from mud and the rubble of the homes that were destroyed in Shujaiya, which makes it even more significant. The artist made these images because he thought that the world has already started to forget, which the world has already moved on. And just looking at it and remembering the Shujaiya massacre, the tens of people who were shot, killed, some of them trapped in their own homes, and the hundreds of people, the thousands that were injured, 60,000 homes are not inhabitable in Gaza as I speak now. Some of them were completely destroyed, some of them partly destroyed. Today, as it stands, there's 100,000 people still displaced with no home in Gaza. The rain has started to fall, the winter has come in. The schools that are functioning right now at 3 shifts because those homeless are staying in school shelters. So there's a lot of pressure on schools. My cousin was telling me that her 3 kids, they go at different times. One goes in the morning, comes home at 1, then the other one goes at 2 and comes home at 4, and there's one that does the much later shift of schooling. It's absolutely devastating, but it tells even a bigger story that we forget in our day-to-day lives, and that is there is an ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestine that started in 1948 and even before, and continues today. When I was watching the bombs fall on Gaza, I kept thinking, why? Why is this happening? And all I could think is, okay, so they've gone after the water treatment system, destroyed it. The electricity plant, destroyed it. Clinics, most of the clinics, the only rehabilitation clinic was destroyed. The Wafa hospital was targeted, even the Shifa hospital was almost targeted, but with the grace of God, it didn't get bombed. So why would we destroy so much infrastructure? And there were the calls to people's homes. There was a deliberate attempt, I think, by Israel to keep the numbers as low as possible because we're crazy about numbers. We say 2,000 were killed or 3,000 were killed. We can talk about numbers, but nobody talks about the loss of home. People don't say hundreds of thousands of people are homeless. And so there was a deliberate attempt to call people's homes, empty the homes and destroy them. Why? And all I could think of was, it's to make Gaza uninhabitable. This is the third war Gaza faces in a short period of time, since 2008. After the first one, people were resilient, they rebuilt, they replanted, and they moved on. After the second time, they rebuilt, they moved on. This time around, it's much harder. There's a lot of people that actually want to leave, but there's no place to go to. The borders are shut. I was looking at some statements by the early Zionists, the founders of the State of Israel, and some of the policies back then that were going on in their minds was to make it so that as many Palestinians willingly leave as possible. And they were saying we need to make good with Jordan, and so to work out a way so that they would go to Jordan or to other Arab countries. Here we are, 67 years later, and the Palestinians are still stateless. Even countries like Jordan are not ready to take in the influx of refugees. In fact, we have a huge refugee crisis now with Syria, with Iraq, with so many countries. So this is not just a story about Gaza. This is a story about people who are deemed excess humanity. We don't want them there. There's ethnic cleansing going on because these people are not considered to be human enough or good enough to stay on the land, because we want to transfer a population and or use the resources, or in the case of Iraq, we want the natural resources of the country, and it doesn't matter who pays the price. It is the human stories that matter at the end. I'm glad Saba started with this. We haven't even talked or met before this evening, but she actually gave me a good introduction to what I do with my work and what I insist on doing, which is humanizing the conflict. It is not about religion. It is not about people fighting over pieces of land and geography. It is about human beings failing to see the other as a human being.
On that note, maybe you can talk a little bit about your most recent project, which opens very soon. It's called A Tale of a City by the Sea.
Okay.
Oh, is there another one?
Tales of a City by the Sea, and I've got flyers here. I'm going to shamelessly promote the project. And there's more flyers on me. If you can't get a flyer, out to me. It's a project that started during the 2008 war on Gaza, and it didn't start as a project. During the 2008 war, I was in Canada at the time. And can I just say that my heart goes out to Canada and to Ottawa today. Ottawa's been my home for 20 years. And so I just feel that I have to say that I feel very sad for what's going on there today, and my heart is with my friends and my loved ones there as well. Anyway, the story started in 2008 with a series of poems I wrote. I do a lot of political commentary work, but sometimes when the politics fail and when the world fails to make sense, I start to write poems. And that's where I find my refuge. So I wrote a few poems during 2008, really exploring my own feelings about being so far away from my city of birth, Gaza, talking to loved ones there and trying to document their stories, and poetry was just flowing out of me. A few years later, I got asked by a friend of mine to put the poems together for an anthology of poetry, which is coming out later on this year. So I started putting the poems together, and as I was reading through the poems, a story started to materialize, and out of that story, a script was born, and that script is this play that we're putting on in November. On the 12th is opening night, and the play is called Tales of a City by the Sea. The story that the play is is about a lot of stories that I've either experienced or I've known other people have experienced in Gaza and in diaspora, put together into this beautiful love story between these two people. Originally we wanted to have the story, the play, open in 3 cities in Gaza, in the West Bank, and here at the same time. Unfortunately, when we started to gear up for the production, when we were starting to recruit people for the production crew and cast and all of that, that's when the last Gaza war took place. And so we've lost our Gaza friends, and didn't use them, should use different words here, but we've lost the Gaza production because a lot of the people who are involved in the Gaza production are just not able to do normal things right now. And an art project, a play, a love story is really not a priority when people can't find shelter, food, and medicine. So now it's just us and the West Bank, and we're opening on the 12th of November.
Congratulations, I know it's been a very long process. I wondered, you've chosen a mediated item that involved artwork, and you're an artist yourself, and I think your family, your father was quite a creative person as well. How important is artwork to you in the context of conflict?
Art is very important because it reminds us that we're human. It is the way you express things straight from the heart. It's the way you communicate a thought and a feeling. You can't really do that in academic papers. You can't really do that in political speech. And I hate slogans, and I hate sometimes, people get caught up in their factional politics. We forget we're human. So art allows us to get in touch with our humanity, and it's a fantastic medium for us to connect to each other. I mean, you don't have to speak the same language to understand painting. You don't have to come from the same cultural background to enjoy a piece of music, and so on and so on.
Changing the topic slightly, I hope it's not rude to mention that you were born in 1967.
No, it's actually on my Wikipedia page. The secret's out.
At quite an auspicious year, I guess, in Israel-Palestine relations. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your journey and how you've come through a few countries to end up in Australia.
Yeah, no, I've had a really interesting journey. I think one of the good things about being a Palestinian in diaspora is you learn, because you've been uprooted and you're floating over borders, you start to get in touch more with the human in you, and you start to identify with different cultures. So I was born in Gaza. We left right after the 1967 war. I was just a baby when my family was exiled, and it wasn't by choice that we left. We were literally exiled. We went through the refugee camp experience, which is something many Palestinians experience. It's the first stop after you've been expelled. That's your first stop. From the refugee camp, which I don't remember much about life in the refugee camp. I left it when I was a toddler. We went to Saudi Arabia. So I had my primary schooling years in Saudi Arabia, which was really, as much as I don't think fondly of these years at all, but I think it's added to who I am and how I view so many things, and who I am as a woman especially. It had a profound impact on me and on the way I relate to women's issues and women's rights. From Saudi Arabia, we immigrated to Australia, and we lived on a farm in Montrose. That's up in the hills near Willowdale. So that was really something, going from Saudi Arabia to Australia. It was a big jump. I remember setting off the plane, and my eyes just went, they almost hurt because they were just I felt my eyes were just being enlarged. I was taking in color. Saudi Arabia, there's no green, and it was just winter, and it was so green. And seeing so many things in the distance without a veil over my eyes, and thinking, whoa, I can see, I can open my eyes. And it was not just in the literal sense that I opened my eyes here, it was in so many ways. I loved my Australian years, my high school years, my university years, and then off to Canada I went, and so these two countries I owe so much to, Canada and Australia, for being, for teaching me so much about so many things. I consider myself both.
I mean, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and interestingly, it's playing quite a big role in the sort of geopolitics of the region at the moment.
Yes.
And I wondered, maybe you could speak a little bit about how the rest of the region, in the turmoil that it's in at the moment, is affecting the Palestinians. In some ways, apart from when a major conflict occurs there. In some ways, it's the quietest of the region at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think what happens is you leave an injustice to fester, and with time it becomes infectious. I think the day the world turned its back on the application of international law and human rights and values that we cherished and held on to, especially after the Second World War, and we allowed exceptionalism in the case of Israel with what it can and cannot do, was really the day we went on a slippery slope. And you know, everything is related in some way or another. As far as the Arab country goes, the dictatorships, their atrocious treatment of the Palestinian refugees, they're turning their back on human rights in so many ways in the Gulf countries, with their labor rights, with the way they treat the foreigners, the way they treat the women. There's a lot to fix there, but I think being involved in the Palestinian cause for so many years has, in a way, been so really good for me, because you're connecting with activists, and the activists have so many other causes, and so you learn that it's all connected. Oppression is infectious, and justice is also infectious, and we have to work together to have a better world.
You mentioned sort of international law and the persecution of the Jews, obviously, in the Holocaust. Is there an irony there in terms of what's happening now in Palestine?
Of course, there is an irony there. I'd like to believe that never again means never again to anyone. But I won't take, I think that's something my colleague, my new friend here, who I've met today, might want to talk more about. But I do think that there is an irony. But, you know, humans are that way, you know. The abuse victims, they become abusers themselves. And you have to break the cycle at some point.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about your involvement with BDS.
I support the boycott, divestments and sanctions call. I think it's the only way right now to, first of all, raise awareness about the Palestinian issue. I like that it is a non-violent means, because I believe in non-violence. I've never practiced violence in my home. I don't accept it in any way. I think that we need to be able to solve our problems without having to resort to violence. So I believe in nonviolence, and I find that the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement also, because it's an anti-discrimination, anti-racism movement, and it's teaching the Palestinians, especially the younger generation, to learn that equality is important. And when you insist on equality for you and for your enemy, you say, I want to be equal to you in rights. I mean, how good is that? You're not saying, I want to be above you. You're not saying, I want to annihilate you. You're actually just saying, I want to be an equal human being like you. And I think that's why I support the movement 100%.
Thanks, Samah. We're going to see Eli's mediated item, which is a short video.
The lid on too well.
And some longer nails.
There we go.
So I want to talk about the Yom Kippur dilemma for Jewish Muslim people. You know, Mincha, the afternoon service, not the most well attended of the Yom Kippur services, but a powerful one. The entire chapter of Leviticus 18 is read, and toward the end, the verse that demonizes sex between men. When I was a younger man, in my 30s, I would go to synagogue, put the towels over my head and weep while that verse was read on Yom Kippur. There were years that I could barely contain the tears, and at some point I decided to add protest. I stood up. I don't know what it meant, and then finally I couldn't even cry anymore. And then one year, struggling to make sense of it all, I decided to get the Aliyah, to be called up to the Torah when those words were read. And with a man you shall not lie, the lyings of a woman, it's an abomination. is read, a calm comes over me that is totally unexpected. All the fear disappears, and I realize my willingness to be vulnerable to the text required the text to be vulnerable to me and to everybody like me. I realize that the people who decide what this verse means have never heard my story, they haven't heard our stories, and if they did, they would no longer be so certain about what that verse means. I realize that what our first task is to take texts and give them faces. Our faces. When our stories are told in the midst of the learned, the rabbis who make these decisions, and when they begin to recognize that among their own flesh and blood, among their students, among their teachers, their friends, are gay and lesbian people, then the letters will become faces, and the very shape of the meaning of the verse will change.
Check a little explanation. So that was a clip from a film called Wrestling with God and Man, and that was a Italian rabbi Stephen Winter. I know that the video doesn't immediately relate to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I think what it represents and shows is the manner in which very strict Jewish law dictate the manner in which a person may think about themselves and about other people. And I think it is, at least, I can only really draw from an Orthodox upbringing, where I was brought up in Cornwall, but I feel that the Orthodox mentality is actually quite frightening in many ways, particularly in the relationship towards Palestinians, because it is just dehumanizing, quite frightening. Their ideas like a Jewish life is worth more than a Palestinian life. And I think it's just really scary thoughts to be carrying around, but it's like this enclosed space where everyone affirms each other and these really, really frightening ideas. And this clip sort of encapsulated the manner in which that can affect someone who may be gay, and then further if someone were to stand up for Palestinian rights in the community, it doesn't go down pretty well either. So I just felt that was a nice way to be in, because what I think Rabbi Greenberg is doing, finding a new way of thinking about the Orthodox mentality, is the way forward for reconciliation in so many ways, to rethink the old laws as opposed to saying religious people are crazy, we're going to legal, we're going to push them aside, and we'll create just a secular society. But to find that middle ground, I think, is a little more productive.
Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the sort of diversity within Judaism itself, because you grew up in a certain sect of Judaism, and maybe you can talk about the variety that's there and how maybe they treat different minority groups.
Yeah, sure. So I was brought up Lubavitch, which is a sect called, it's otherwise known as Chabad. Basically, we followed a rabbi who's passed away in 1994. We believed that he was the Messiah. And so we dressed as he would dress, and we'd say prayers and we'd learn what he would learn. Everything we did felt like we were bringing on the imminence of the Messiah. And it is a mentality that says you are chosen. And not only are you chosen, but within the chosen people, you are special. So the other for us was secular Jews, was other Jews who never stepped out to meet any non-Jewish people. So the first time I ever met any non-Jewish people, had any non-Jewish friends, was when I went to university. And it was there that I was faced with my own prejudices. It was the first time that I'd ever had experienced within myself. I had these knee-jerk reactions. If someone were to talk about, say, their mother wasn't Jewish, for instance, and they said, well, I'm Jewish, and I would go, well, no, you're not really. According to the Lord, you're not. Slowly I started to hear myself, and I go, my God, it's horrible thing to say. And but gradually I could feel myself in my mentality, and my mind started to slowly open. And then when I go back and I listen to people, and I just feel like I have to keep my mouth shut, because the mentality is, as long as you remain within a circle, you refuse to challenge it, just continue to snowball. And I didn't answer the question, but there is quite a variety of levels within the Jewish community of Orthodox Jews and secular Jews, and varying opinions of Israel, very pro-Israel, if I'm honest. However, I did see a fantastic film called Five Broken Cameras, and I did see it at a Jewish youth group, which I feel wasn't horrible. That was, I felt that was quite progressive, and I was stepping in the direction I felt comfortable.
How is the state of Israel viewed in the Lubavitch church? Can I call it a sect, I guess? Yeah, or...
It's movement started, the average Jews believed that Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, was promised to the Jews at the time of the Torah, so a long, long time ago, and they wouldn't recognize Israel as a state. So when I was growing up, we weren't allowed to have Israeli flags, we weren't allowed to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, because it was considered, we were meant to say, no, Israel's always been there. Then it's just been this shift as I've grown older, and it's so weird, and now there's Israeli flags everywhere, we go to marches, it just becomes such a different mentality. There's a book called The Chosen by Chaim Potok, which I think shows it very well. It was originally, he just talks very accurately about the way in which everyone was protesting the establishment of Israel. They didn't believe it should happen, but as soon as it was there and was established, they just pretended it's like they forgot that they were ever protesting and now they were backing and for it. So at the time, I think, and now I think it's become this real like fundamentalist movement and it's become like a rallying sort of thing.
Is that a different way in which the original texts are being read by different people, do you think?
In what sense, sorry?
Or the Torah is being, I mean, you mentioned it's changed from being Eretz Israel, I think, the place that was promised, to kind of more politicalization of that in terms of the state of Israel itself being founded and waving flags. And so is that a way that the texts themselves have been changed within the understanding of Judaism?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the texts have been changed. There's the idea, I think what the situation now is and how the Orthodox community may justify it is and it sounds so critical, but I do have family and along with many members of the Orthodox community, so don't take me as like I'm bashing them. But I think it's the idea that now Jewish lives are at stake and they're in danger and therefore we have to protect them in that way. So, but there are so many loopholes, and I think that the justifications within the text are secondary to the emotional responses, and I think the responses are to rally and get behind and so that this is our state, so we're going to push for it, dehumanizing everyone else in our world.
Maybe, I know you went on a program called Birthright as part of during your schooling. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that program because it in some ways explains a little bit about the understanding of Judaism towards Israel.
So yeah, it's as racist as it sounds. Like it is birthright. It means that if you're Jewish, there's a philanthropist in America who funds people who are Jewish to Israel. And if you meet someone on the program, they will pay for you to get married in Israel. That's how it works. It's like a way of building Zionism.
It's a small Jewish wedding.
Yeah, no, huge. They'll go all out. So when I was there, it was very much a fellow to propaganda, and I used it as like a free trip, so I could go to Europe. But when I was there was a lot of like we visit graves and we listen to stories from Israeli soldiers, and Israeli soldiers talk with us, and but there was nothing from the Palestinian side. Then I went back again for 2 weeks with my girlfriend at the time. I was staying in the Palestinian hostel just outside the old city, so I did get to have a slightly different perspective. I was unfortunately been unwell at the time, so I couldn't travel as much. But it was really nice for me to see Israel from a slightly different light, even if it was only for a couple of weeks.
Maybe that a little bit touches on the book that you've written, which is The Boys I Managed Being a Proper Jew. I wonder, I mean, similar question to Samah in a way, is art in a way, and not so much, it's not about Israel per se, but it's about a gay person within the Jewish community. Does art have an activism role for you as well?
Yes, it does, but I really do like the middle ground sort of approach to it. That is more of a discussion rather than forcing any views down everyone's throat. I don't think that really gains anything, it just sort of pushes them away. So I think conversations like this are fantastic. With the book, I did make a conscious choice not to mention Israel because I knew the reader would go in with those expectations. And I wanted them to go, oh, I can't believe you didn't mention Israel, maybe there are other enemies to Judaism as well. So, but...
I mean, another element you mentioned in the book is something that you call frying out. Is that what happened to you?
Yeah, so frying out means when you stop being religious. I don't know if it's frying like a frying pan or if frying is like the Yiddish word. I still don't know to this day. It basically means you stop being religious. So when I was 17, I just realized that I kind of saw this older boy in the school who was impressed as not pleasure. That is not going to be me, I can't have it. So I kind of had a panic attack and And I've since learned some of the personal extremes, so I think that no matter what, I'm always going to go to some extremes. So I went all the way to an atheist end, and I haven't really been able to pull myself back to believe in God. But so yeah, when I stopped believing in God, it was a genuine question of would I remain religious, just because of my friends and family. But then I realized that wasn't for me either, so I moved to Brunswick. Which is fine. It's just like as yuppie as corporate. It's just a little more fun.
Did you know other people that have done the banks as well?
It's a great quote.
No, generally we travel in packs. Like if a class is fried out, then the whole class. But I had a very, very religious class. There were quite a lot of boys from Russia. They brought in a lot of Russian refugees, and they would let them go to school if they couldn't pay full fees. So the school was kind of divided, interestingly, with Orthodox boys from Australia, and the less religious boys tended to be from Russia. And because I was Australian, we had that background, I tended to stay with the post boys, and then so when I left, it was just very much on them.
Getting back to Israel a little bit, maybe you can talk about, you've got friends and family there still. What are their feelings about what's happening there, and even with Palestine and even the border region, maybe?
Yeah. It's they're as right-wing as it comes, but it's to a point where it's kind of scary, I think. And I was at the Sydney Jewish Writers Festival. I think I mentioned this now. About 90% of the panels were about Israel, and one woman came out. It's called The Many Faces of Israel, The Four Faces of Israel. And I forgot her name because I'm just like that. But she came out and she was in character as a very Orthodox woman. She started to go on and on and on and on. And then she's just like, I'm glad that my children don't go to the army because of the Orthodox. I think it might be changing how you don't go to the army. You're excused to study Torah. And everyone in the audience just got furious and go, how can you say that? There are people dying so you can be protected. And then one of the women was so angry that she stormed out, and then she broke character and got an actress who was my next. And she changes costume, speaks as another woman. And the thing is, every character that she had just elicited the most immediate and honest responses. She was so convincing. And the last woman that she came out was a Palestinian woman. And the thing is that I think if a Palestinian woman had genuinely be out there, I don't think the Jewish crowd would have responded so honestly. They made sense of themselves. But because they knew she was Jewish, I think they just kind of let loose. And some of the things just awful, which is like, so what do you suggest we should do? And someone said, just kill more. Oh my, that's terrifying. But I really think the mentality, if you push it and push it and push it and push it, could actually come down to this quite frightening fundamental stuff.
I'm going to ask you both two questions. You can decide who starts. We've asked the same questions every week, changing the countries. So your questions are, what does Israel and Palestine mean to you?
I knew I should have read the questions you sent in advance. I know what it doesn't mean. Can I start with that? I think for me, what it doesn't mean is a geographical piece of land. What it doesn't mean is olive trees and holy grounds and mosques and tourist places. I think for me, it just means the absence of justice, the absence of equality, the display of utter inhumanity in some cases. And I don't think that it's something that's just about Palestine. Once you've been weaved into the tapestry of human rights work and activism, you start to understand that these are not places on maps. These are people and lives and lack of education and indoctrination and racism and oppression, which breeds more injustice, and abuse, which breeds more abuse. So to me, what it is just the absence of justice and the need for us to connect as humans and to work together to make life better for everyone, not just in Israel and Palestine.
I just simply guilt. Like, I know it's very huge.
I just spoke for like half an hour.
So it is. I think that there is quite a lot of guilt, not just in myself, and that's why many Jewish people maybe approach us so adamant and angry about it. I think I feel also defensive is also be for guilty person. So I think for me, I always felt kind of guilty when I think about Israel and when I'm automatically associated to Israel, which I am. I'm not going to try and escape it. I think I'm really Jewish, and so probably those two things. But I did love it as a country. It's just so unbelievably beautiful, and I'd like to visit it again. But it would be as like a lucky lost in the tourist, but yeah, so even that makes me very happy.
The second question is to look into your crystal ball and tell me what you think Israel and Palestine is going to look like in 5 years' time.
Answer that one first.
You read the question, Deli.
Yeah, I just don't, personally I don't see it being too much different from it. I think what 5 years is just like that's a blip, and I think Australia will change all that time. So. And it just feels like I've been hearing the same thing for my entire life. It always feels like there's something, and there are immediate reactions and responses, and it does snowball and it does feed into itself. I guess I'm not schooled enough to say the specifics, and I don't think any response I can give would be any sort of crystal ball sort of response that you could then take to the bank and come back in 5 years and see how it worked. I just think it probably will be very interesting.
Crystal ball, huh? I think what I see is 5 years from now, we will definitely be dealing more with the one-state reality. When we first started talking about Israel moving towards a one-state reality in 2005, for me anyway, when I started talking, people didn't believe us, they dismissed us, they dismissed anyone who was saying, you cannot unscramble this egg, we don't have enough power on the Palestinian side to negotiate with the Israelis. This is a status quo that's going to go on for a while, etc., etc. Now everybody is more aware of it, even Kerry mentioned the apartheid word. So I think 5 years from now, it's going to be absolutely mainstream. People will come to a realization that we are dealing with a one-state apartheid reality. 5 years from now, the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement would also be mainstreamed by then. We're already seeing a lot of artists and public figures come out and support the boycott, divestments and sanctions. So I think that's going to be a movement to reckon with. I hope that we will not have the PA still lingering 5 years from now. My God, it's been dying for like 10 years and still is not dead. And the reason I say that is I'm not trying to be mean to any particular people within the Palestine Authority or within the Fatah faction or the leadership, but the Palestinian leadership that is embodied in the Palestinian Authority have signed on to enter into a framework that only gives advantage to Israel. It gives absolutely no advantage to the Palestinians. And for as long as the Palestinian leaders, the Hamas, the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, continue to try to play a game of diplomacy and negotiations within the Palestinian Authority framework, that's not going to take 5 minutes, but I'll try to be fast. But if they're trying to achieve this within the framework, nothing's ever going to get achieved. You cannot have a liberation movement that is calling for true liberation for a people who are being oppressed and kept in Tibetistans, when this movement is relying on its salaries to be received from the very people or through the very people who's occupying them. Every time the Palestinian Authority says we're going to the ICC, we're going to take Israel to the International Court of Justice for war crimes, the US and the European Union and funders pull the strings and they say, oh, we'll put it off for a few more years. So right now it's part of the problem, the PA is part of the problem, it's not part of the solution. So I think in 5 years, we'll see, but hopefully they'll not be around anymore. So we can actually get on with the business of liberation.
Yes, I'm going to
try facilitate. So if we could just kindly keep it to one question or comment, whatever you want, just to kind of allow for more time. We've tried to allow as much time as possible for questions and comments. I'll try and stand up to see all hands. And I just kindly remind you that we keep it as a dialogue. Okay, so who'd like to go first? Yes?
Yes. Is it Samah? Yeah, it's Samah. I just want to ask about how the Gazans feel about Hamas, if their support is growing or getting less, and also about dissent over there.
Yes, sure. It's really interesting. Hamas was losing a lot of popularity just before the war started, and they were very desperate. They actually started to sign on to agreements with the Palestinian Authority. They were moving ahead with the unity government, which saw them lose a lot of power. Abbas dictated whatever he wanted, and he got whatever he wanted, because Hamas was actually being choked up and ran out of funds and ran out of friends, especially in the region after the Muslim Brotherhood lost their power in Egypt. So they were very weak, and their popularity had dwindled just before the war, and a lot of people in Gaza were ready to look for an alternative because they had enough. And then the war started, and the absolute result of it when it comes to the popularity of Hamas has been that Hamas's popularity skyrocketed during the war, whereas Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah faction, their popularity dwindled. So it was good for Hamas in that sense. But right now, I think because the war ended and the ceasefire came, but nothing was delivered, people are still under siege. So there's a lot of people questioning the tactics that were used by Hamas. They're questioning why they talk the talk, but then when it comes to delivery, they weren't able to lift the siege or to get Israel to lift the siege. So it's hard to gauge how popular they are, but the recent polls show that they're still more popular than Fatah. They've both lost, but they're still more popular than the Fatah faction, which is the PA faction in Gaza. Dissent is an interesting question also, because I think people tend to fight for their civil liberties more when they're not facing insecurity on a daily basis, when they're not running after just trying to get their food and their medicine and so on. So there isn't that much in terms of dissent. Hamas once in a while will try to pass a law like banning the smoking of shishas by women. And then the women would go out and start smoking their shishas, and Hamas would be like, oh, fine, whatever. Or they'd start attacking boys who have long hair and try to cut their hair, but then they get bad publicity, so they stop. I think too that Hamas is aware that there is huge international sympathy with Gaza, and a lot of it comes from the left, from people who don't subscribe to Hamas's Hamas's fundamentalist beliefs when it comes to women and civil liberties and so on. And so they try not to upset these people too much. If it makes the media, then they stop. It's not really that bad. They're not ISIS by any stretch of the imagination. They're not. I went to Gaza 2 years ago, and I didn't wear my hijab. I went everywhere. I had my play reading. It's a love story. I didn't encounter anything. I don't know if they just decided to turn a blind eye. But that was my experience.
question over here.
Yeah,
so-
Saba, yeah, did you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So it's basically asking whether there was, I guess, room for interpretation, they're saying, or...
Is there anything in your theological traditions that would be compatible with recognizing the humanity of Palestinians and their rights?
So, did you hear it? No. Okay, so it's asking whether within the Jewish theology there's room to start interpreting it to recognize the humanity of Palestinians. So the way I like to think about a question like that is my father's a doctor, and when he was practicing, he was religious, and there was a law at that time that if he was on call on Friday night and Shabbat came in and there were non-Jewish patients in the hospital, he wasn't allowed to stay on to help them because you aren't allowed to break Shabbat for the sake of a non-Jewish life. And there's also a law which says that if you know a woman can't conceive, you're not allowed to marry her because you have to have children. Now, neither of these laws will be enforced today. Nobody in their right mind will enforce it. And in order to maintain the integrity of the text, they'll find interpretations to say how it will be okay. But I think that only happens because there is a social pressure. So there are many women obviously in the community who would say, well, screw you, we're going to get married. And there are many doctors who are going, there's no way I'm going to leave patients to die, it's insanity. But even amongst, let's just say, because the area I studied most, within the gay community and the Jewish community, there isn't that social pressure, and so it's just able to be sidelined. And I think there just isn't the social pressure to force people to find interpretation within the text. I'm sure if they were adamant to find it, they certainly could. There's a manner of romanticizing how old, there's like an authority to the text, and the older, the more authority it has. But people have been interpreting Jewish law for even up until today, and so there will certainly be some liberal interpretations of that.
What about the more sort of modern interpretations of Judaism, like in the Reform movement or the liberal movement?
Oh, the Reform movement has definitely is fantastic. That's in a book called Shira Hadasha, and they're wonderful, very inclusive, work a lot with the Muslim community and recognizing gay marriage and everything. They're really wonderful. But I think in Melbourne especially, it's a very conservative community. It's mostly built on Holocaust survivors, and they just remain very traditional right from the get-go. It's very different to America. There's not so much of a push for that. And yeah, it would be specific to each culture, not just large Jewish areas.
I've been part of demonstrations in Melbourne, and I've been intrigued when you walk along the main part of Lonsdale Street or something like this, that you see people looking at you in a mystified fashion. And I don't think that's different in whether it be in New York or wherever it is. But the people watching you from the gutter have no idea what on earth you're demonstrating about. And it seems to me this harks back to the lack of the media influence that the Palestinians can bring to bear, because we never hear the Palestinian story in the media. We don't. We very quickly hear the gentleman who always speaks for the Israel stories about what terrible things the Palestinians are doing, but we don't hear that other part until you have all of the world being more familiar. I think we've talked here tonight about how the West is starting to think more sympathetically to Palestine and Gaza, but until we can start having a voice somewhere, are you going to change things?
It certainly is not for lack of people who are able to speak to the media or for lack of trying by these people. When I was in Canada in 2008 and the war was taking place at the time against Gaza, on Gaza, I was called in by CTV at least a dozen times. CTV is our national news broadcaster, TV, and I was asked to comment on breaking news stories and so on. And it wasn't that hard to get access. in Canada. I don't know why here, since I've been here for 4 years, I I've tried to speak to the media, but they haven't been interested. Not only that, during this last horrible 50 days of bombing Gaza, I've contacted the media almost on a daily basis. And I've been told by my contacts, we want to run human stories. Do you know people who have a loved one who died in Gaza, who were killed in Gaza? Tell us your human story, but we don't need political analysis. We don't want to go there. But we can have somebody who's from the Jewish community speaking about how they're worried about their family in Israel, and we can have someone from the Palestinian community talking about how worried. Put the two stories together, and that's as far as we go. I did get on the radio to talk about it on Raphael Epstein, the driver from Israel. So that was good. That was the one time. It was very strange because here I was doing Al Jazeera commentary and talking to BBC Radio and working with news sites in Canada and in the US. But in Australia, it is really difficult to get in. But I'll get there one day. We will get there. It's not me, it's the next generation. But somebody needs to get in there.
Do you think there's a fear there amongst the media and maybe people in general to speak politically about it because it does stir up so it is a topic that stirs up so much emotion?
I think it has to do with the screen factor. When I do radio talks here, I was also a guest with the John Fain show a few times. They get a lot of negative calls. People, when they hear a story that they like, very few will get on their email and will write, yeah, that was really good, thank you for having that person speak. But if you don't like what you hear, then you'll get on and you'll get abusive. So there's a lot of screaming people out there. They're not necessarily representative of what the majority want to hear in their news media. But I think there is quite a bit of intimidation as well and fear, and it's just not easy to show the Palestinians as humans yet in Australia's media, unfortunately.
I might just add that there's also been studies done on different kind of cultures of journalism in Australia and the way that you teach journalism, where it's also that human aspect. So regardless of Palestine, Israel, it is a trend to kind of talk about things within that let bring in a human story of someone, and kind of that's the way that things have been done here. So that might be one factor to consider. Any other questions? Yes?
The other thing is we're not really getting ideas of dissenting Israeli voices, whether it's activists working with Palestinian ONGs or the so-called. And as well, also the new historian of Israel, like Gideon Allah, they've been very critical of the Israeli state. And
he got on Q&A.
His books about Israel. We haven't heard of Noam Chomsky's pronunciations for a long time. So, any comments?
Very briefly, I think the peace movement, if we can call it a peace movement in Israel, is suffering greatly. It's not very well pronounced during the bombings on Gaza. Several hundred people went out to protest in Israel, and then they were beaten down by the fascists. There certainly is a challenge to get a genuine peace movement going in Israel that actually can step outside of the norm and say, look, we can coexist with these people. I mean, we're living on their land, and, where there has to be a way to compromise and to coexist and to live as one. We don't want the one-state apartheid reality. There's got to be other options. We're not there yet, and maybe you can talk more about why there's not enough dissent in Israel.
I think personally my experience is that there is somewhat depends where you're getting out of who you are. But important idea that we do try to simplify media with sound bites, and perhaps it could just be it's one newsworthy to show it as a simple one on one side and the other conflict. It's not as newsworthy, I guess, to have these sorts of courses. But I could just be being cynical, so if you want, please don't know that.
You might not be able to actually answer this in front of some curious. Why do you think Hamas targets civilians? This is not a defense of Israel, but at least I understand what Israel is doing, as you articulated before. Hamas has no chance of defeating Israel or dissuading them from attacking like that civilians. If anything, they sort of give them an excuse to come back in. But what's the deal?
Well, I like the challenge, so I will answer that question. Why does Hamas target civilians? I don't think they target civilians. I don't think they have the capacity to target. I think they just shoot them rockets and hope that they hit something that's going to win them some kind of a battle victory. They have very primitive technology, homemade rockets. They're no match for Israel's weapons. Israel was dropping 1-ton bombs off F-16s. Hamas was shooting those rockets that could hardly really direct in any particular direction. As far as if you want my opinion on the rockets, I don't think that indiscriminate bombardment of areas where civilians live, should be done. I don't believe that as a tactic. I don't believe that they have a moral high ground when they're indiscriminately targeting towards civilian areas. But more than that, as a tactic also, I question the sanity of that tactic. So, that's my opinion.
I know we're having this conversation here tonight in East Brunswick, but if we were to try and suggest having something like this in Caulfield, and I was wondering how your family or friends from that area would be interested in coming to listen to this dialogue. Do you think that would actually influence and maybe fry some of these people into changing their perspectives, possibly?
If this was in Caulfield, it'd be a lot louder. It can get quite aggressive and actually get uncomfortably heavy. But that's not necessarily bad.
I'm going to surprise you. We did have something similar in Caulfield.
How'd it go?
It went really well. I think people wanted to hear a Palestinian speak, and they felt they were in a safe place, in a safe, it was during the, what is it called, Limud office, when I first came here, before I was identified as a BDSer and put on the bad people's list. The room was filled with people who were curious, very respectful. It was good. I think we need more of these.
Sure.
And I don't think that labeling people and putting them on blacklists is really the way to go. I find it funny sometimes because I read they write the BDSer, Samah Sabawi. Really grow up.
Thanks.
Just going back to the Palestine the recent war, the one thing that I found really bizarre about what I learned from the media is the tunnels. The tunnels, which sort of, I saw a graphic on the news. It was very storybook-like. It's sort of like, these monsters are kind of crawling underneath your bed, and they're almost got there. And speak up.
You have to repeat the whole thing.
All right.
With the hand gestures, because you guys are missing the hand gestures.
I'm asking about the tunnels in the recent war, where Israel discovered these tunnels, which were almost about to sort of burst out in towns in Israel, and the Israelis kind of came in at last, just at the right minute, and just stopped that happening. It just seemed very theatrical and very storybook, that whole narrative of IDF came in just in the nick of time to sort of save the Israeli state from these tunnels, and they got this technology, and surely they knew that was happening. And I know the media narrative just seems to be so storybook-like, and goodies and baddies and adventure story-like, and I just wanted to comment on that.
Well, I don't know that Israel actually did destroy all the tunnels to start with. we don't know enough about that story. It did seem like quite the tale. There are tunnels, and to go back to the question before about Hamas's tactics, Hamas was strictly planning to use these tunnels, or so they say anyway, to target Israeli soldiers on the other side. They could have reached the kibbutz, they could have reached areas where there's Jewish life, but they didn't. And suddenly, when the war started, that was the narrative that we were given. In fact, the narrative changed a few times. The last story was, we're just in there because of the tunnels. That the tunnel story was the last one that Israel offered as an explanation as to why they were bombing Gaza. But tunnels are fascinating. When we went to Gaza 2 years ago, there were issues of us trying to cross into the border. And so, we sat waiting for our papers to be processed. It took 7 hours of waiting. Within these 7 hours, we were approached at least 5 times by a guy saying, just come with me, $100 each, and you'll be in Gaza before lunch. And it was, you'll be in Gaza before afternoon tea.
Was that from Rafah?
That was from Rafah, yes.
So it was border with Israel. Border with Egypt.
But they did become an important part of the infrastructure of the city, because without the tunnels, goods weren't getting in, people weren't able to get in and out. A lot of people were using them to connect with their loved ones on the other side. In fact, if I can just refer you back to my play, I talk about the tunnels in my play, and one of the characters ends up having to use it to go see his loved one. But yeah, tunnels is what you get when you shut all the borders. What do you expect? People will dig.
Question. We'll have a question here and then we'll take yours then.
Thanks. Thank you for asking questions and your stories. I was just wondering, before we've been discussing the use of art in a conflict context. Now there is a lot of, or there's art in bringing the Palestinian story towards the outside, but there's also a lot of art coming into Palestine, as it is the area in the world that has most foreign NGOs, foreign workers, aid workers per capita in the world. I happen to have done some research on this a couple of years ago, where I lived in Palestine, and the research respondents / friends that I made there would tell me often, we don't need yet another 3-month class in Spanish. We don't need yet another person to come in and teach us theater. We don't need another person that tries to relieve the suffering of the children by being a clown or circus. We need the governments of these people to put pressure on Israel. Which then brings me actually to Noam Chomsky, who someone just mentioned him. He just wrote a piece saying the only thing that is going to sway Israel is for America to turn course. So, brings me to the question, what really is, and that's a bit playing the devil's advocate, excuse me for doing that, but what really is the value of art in a conflict context?
I grew up with art. My dad is a poet. And for me, the value of art was learning the story in more than one way. His poetry literally ran through my veins. His words, his experience. It wasn't like him saying, listen, we were exiled. But the story was moving. His poetry, Mahmoud Darwish's poetry, even plays that we watched as little kids, and I was a big fan of Awad al-Toshi, he's a character, a Syrian character. They had all these political plays with messages. You actually learn so much through art. Not everybody just wants to pick up an academic book and read it. Not everybody wants to read Noam Chomsky. Sometimes people just want to sit down and watch a movie and learn something from it. Sometimes my schooling, my dad schooled me through a lot of art mediums. I remember watching Cry Freedom and learning about what's happening in South Africa, the Serious Roots, learning about the civil rights movement, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a great way to teach and to reach people in a way that, you know, the masses out there would rather sit down and be entertained and learn something than pick up a book, a dry book, and read it.
For the artists, it's also the process. The artists themselves, they need that process. Whether people actually see the stuff at the end of the day, they're doing it as part of their own therapy and their own process of what they're experiencing.
Absolutely.
And if they don't have that, then they shrivel up themselves. Those people who do those sort of things. So.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier about dealing with the Gaza, the war on Gaza through just writing poetry, letting it flow. It's a form of expression.
Question? Talking a lot about Hamas and about Gaza, but the war on Palestinians isn't just in Gaza. We say something about the threat to the Palestinians of East Jerusalem and also to all the olive groves up and down the West Bank.
Yeah, there's ongoing ethnic cleansing. Jerusalem is a big target for that. There's the Judaization of Jerusalem going on. We have relatives and friends who are so scared that they're going to lose their permit. In the West Bank, it's really bad. It's people are living literally in bantustans, walled up behind checkpoints, unable to connect to one another. It is ongoing. The reason Gaza takes up so much space here tonight is because my personal experience comes from my connection to Gaza, because I'm from Gaza. But I don't see Gaza as not being part of Palestine. It's just a chapter in the horrible story of ethnic cleansing that began in Palestine before 1948.
I have a question here. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, or a very fair comment, but I grew up with Jews in Iraq and always tried to find line on Israel from the Muslims. I think from a young age is just totally devastating to realise the difference between the image and reality of Israel and Palestine. But I'm just on the popular culture side as well as art. I thought the TV series Promise and the film Tears of Gaza were both really phenomenal education from consciousness and from our mainstream communities and shows up and understand
How was the experience with Black Diamond Campus?
That was life-changing for me. I had an Israeli friend and she was in tears. It did get, the reason when you asked before about having a show like this there is because it wasn't corporate and it did get quite heated. Maybe it's just when you're alone when they were talking about whether the war was effective in stopping suicide bombings. The person who was speaking at the front said that was actually one of the tactical moves in Palestine rather than the war itself. And the girl I was sitting next to, who's a bit more conservative background, just got very, very upset and very, very angry. But the film itself was just so beautifully done. It basically just showed how each of the cameras were broken, how they went for these peaceful processes, some terrible names, and basically stuff how spectacular it was. But yeah, I think that I think the question before about the benefit about, I think we'd know what the benefit about was if we suddenly took it away and didn't have it. I think it actually dictates and influences the way we think and the way we don't acknowledge anymore.
I'm asking one simplistic question in a way that, a lot of the Jewish community here doesn't have any ties with Israel itself, but yet there's that really strong feeling there about it. Is that purely a religious one? Based in the religion?
Not necessarily. What's called the armchair Zionist, which is where you're just kind of angry and backing and shouting. But I really do think it's just simplistic and it's just taking a side of it because it's self-serving. I don't think it's genuinely engaged with the reality. And very few people spend that much time there and they romanticize it, as you said. And so I just think it's almost an immature mentality rather than the same.
If there is to be a resolution of the situation within the next 5 years, the energy for that going to be generated between the two states or the two regions? Or are we going to have to rely on some sort of international or global movement to bring it to pass? I mean, President Obama, one of his early things was he was going to solve the problem. We had Tony Blair there as a special ambassador after he became Prime Minister. Are we going to look to the United Nations or world leaders to help solve it, or can it be done locally between the leaders and the people on the spot?
Sadly, I don't think it can be done locally. I think there has to be pressure from the international community. There has to be pressure. I'm not sure if the US will come through in 5 years, but definitely we need to see more European countries trying to take a more balanced position. We need the negotiations not to be overseen by the US anymore and not to be forced on the Palestinians, because really we're forcing the Palestinians to negotiate the rights that they're already entitled to under international law. There needs to be international intervention, and I think that's another reason why the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement is an important movement, because it does start at the grassroots, but it aims to reach the top eventually in the form of sanctions and so on against Israel.
After the Second World War, I mean, the Zionists wanted Israel anyway, but before the Second World War, but with the Holocaust and everything, the reason for the reason given the establishment of Israel was as a safe refuge for all Jews. But do you think that having the state of Israel actually makes things more dangerous for Jews throughout the world?
That's an interesting point, because I remember my grandparents were all Holocaust survivors. Generally, people were allowed to name their children during the war. But my grandfather was older, he was 21 when the war started. And just before he passed away last year, he talked about where they would go, and they didn't want to go to Israel. They didn't even want to go to America, because they said it was actually a really hard life, so they came here. And we have a huge population here, and I don't necessarily think that the idea of a Jewish state is wonderful, whether we created a safe haven for refugees after the war. I could be wrong. I'm sure that there were many people who did so, but I wouldn't say any more necessarily than Australia and America.
While listening to all this, I don't make a comment actually. That is, it is actually very hard to understand what's going on. It's easy for us, we all have political bias. It tends to favor one side or another, and by doing that, we tend to think that one side is right and one side is wrong. And I think a good way to illustrate it is, for me as an immigrant to Australia, for example, Australia has 200 years of history in a collective sense, so before there was also a lot of history globally. But in that 200 years, we haven't managed to come to a conclusion or a resolution with the one group of people who has a problem, which is the original inhabitants of the country. So you take that, you say it's a 200 years old problem, it's a one group of people. You look in the Mediterranean, there's 5,000 years of war. If you look at Bible, it's never peaceful. It's not like it's a place that's prosperous and peaceful for 6,000 years and then suddenly a problem. So there's 5,000 years of history of war, and it involves 30 or 40 different groups and identities of people. It's not that easy to kind of understand the subcurrents and all the problems that are permeating that creates the subtext of why is it right now in conflict. When people think about how can it become a problem, I think we need an outside thoughtful intervention which is constructive, not destructive, which doesn't tend to favor, oh, this is the right narrative and this is the wrong narrative, but tends to
it is quite simple. There are no 35 groups of people. You have Jews and non-Jews who live under Israel's control. The Jews get full preferential treatments. The other groups, so we're talking about two groups here, the non-Jews, who are Palestinians, who are the indigenous inhabitants of the land, are divided into several categories, and they get preferences depending on their ID card. So if you have an ID card that you are a Palestinian who is living in the West Bank, then you have restricted rights within the West Bank. But you cannot go to Gaza. You cannot enter Jerusalem. If you have a Gaza ID, you have even more restricted rights. You cannot leave Gaza altogether to go anywhere. You get no services from Israel. You get Israel not living up to its responsibility under international law and under the Geneva Convention in treating the people it controls and occupies. There is only one state, and there are two categories of people within that one state, Jews and non-Jews. It's not complicated. The non-Jews are saying we want equal treatments, dignity, and human rights. It's not a complicated issue. It is not complicated.
Certainly true on that legal level, though, Samah. But I mean, in some ways, what maybe this gentleman is saying, even within the Jewish community within Israel itself, even though it's not legal bias, I mean, there's definitely discrimination between.
But we're talking about the systematic discrimination that is in the law of the country.
I know you don't want to say
No, go ahead.
This is a dialogue. It's within the spirit of the dialogue.
I totally agree. I think the point is that as long as the conversation is not about the technicalities, which is what we're talking about, it's not going to be easy. That is to say that if people could just drop all their baggage and say, okay, there is an issue, how do we solve an issue, and then we solve that tomorrow. Because there's only really 4 or 5 aspects to it, right? Of the dismantling of the settlement. So technically, it's not a complicated issue. But we will never get to that because of the amount of baggage. So it's complicated because of the baggage, because there hasn't been the possibility to process on either side the amount of baggage that each one of those people carries.
There is no baggage on. Look, there is no baggage on the Palestinian side. They're not asking for the moon. They're asking for equal rights. It should be something that we can all understand here. Equality. As for the other side, it's funny you say they've been fighting for 5,000 years. A lot of the people who are on the extreme side of things are the ones who are coming into Israel from the outside. Not people who are being there and fighting for all these years. The settlers are one example of that. Most of them are coming in from the outside.
It's sort of a question, it's a comment, really from this field. But I was in Jerusalem a few weeks ago, and knowing what's going on, it wasn't until I got there that I was sort of told, because this is kind of a question for Eli, about stories like the settlers who come in and they purposely pay 5 times the property price to live in the Palestinian border, and they drop rocks on dead children in the street. And when the Palestinians then put up nationwide, they drop bags of urine or something, and the Palestinians, I saw a settler who's just walking down the street with his gun over his shoulder, just casually. So the Palestinians doing that, it wouldn't happen. And even to the ridiculousness of apparently settler roads get 5 minutes of green lights, Palestinian roads get 30 seconds. Like, it just seems so stupid, but I don't understand. I know that the settlers are the minority, they're not all Jews, but do Jewish people and Israelis think about that and want to distance themselves? Because it's awful. Like, even anyone can drop a brick on a 3-year-old's head, even if that's any desired outcome.
Yeah, so I'd say what it's like at the internet, because although we act as a large group, we are still individuals, all of us, so we have mentalities that dictate the way that we act. Let's just look at the fundamental way in which I think it is a fundamentalist or it is a dehumanizing act.
Yeah, but why don't you speak out against it? So I'm saying I'm sure most people wouldn't do that, but I've also never heard anyone say bad settlers.
Yeah, certainly. I think some people are. And I just guess it's that defensiveness and to have a fundamentalist way of thinking is, well, we say that although in defensiveness, they will know and these are the reasons why, and keep within a circle of people people who will firmly and we maintain prejudice of them. And it's seen and replicated all throughout culture and history and society. It is quite a disturbing manner of capacity for human beings to exercise and to agree on as well.
I'd just like to add on the settlers and their behavior, their atrocious behavior in the Palestinian areas. Even those people who call themselves the liberal Zionists who speak out against the settlements, in fact they want people to boycott settlements, they don't seem to make the connection that the settlements are part of Israel. They're funded by the government that you're voting for. It's part of the big structure. It is not isolated from the rest of Israel. They didn't land, on Palestinian hills from the moon. They were actually brought in by the same state that you don't want people to, people like Peter Weinhardt who say, just boycott the settlements, don't boycott Israel, just boycott the settlements. But, the settlements don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of the state. They're part of the state's policy of ethnic cleansing and expanding on Palestinian lands and getting rid of the Palestinian population in the process.
I have one question here. Are there any other questions? Trying to open it up. Sorry, you still have the last question. And then, of course, we can continue the dialogue.
I think that collective paralysis as Australians are reporting on it is just a bit of information that was really difficult to get into from Australian media. In reporting on let alone participating in the discourse surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think it's more nuanced and troubling than simple conservatism. So my question is to you as people who identify as both non-Indigenous Australian and as Jewish and Palestinian, do you think there's credibility to the argument that Australian apathy and fear of political discourse on this issue is precipitate about apathy and fear in acknowledging and discussing the ethnic cleansing and displacement and genocide that similarly forms the basis of our own nationality? Do you think that's circumstantial questions?
I don't think there's, I don't know if I'd call it apathy. There's definitely during the war on Gaza, there was a lot of interest. People that have never talked about Gaza or Israel or Palestine were talking about it. My neighbor who doesn't know anything about anything political came to me and said, have you heard about this place called Gaza? And I'm like, have I ever heard about this place? So, there is interest. I think the media is just pandering to its own interests and its own funders and its own corporate policies. There is interest. I don't think the Australian public is apathetic, and I think a lot more Australians than we know actually sympathize with the Palestinian cause.
I think it was the conclusion that you drew was very academical and it's something that we opened up to discussion. But I don't think it was necessarily as simple as that to say that we feel that we have to specifically because I think it was quite complex, but certainly a fascinating point.
My question was actually very similar.
Yes, all right. Okay. All right. Well, we'll wrap up then. Thank you very much. Thanks Samah and Eli for coming and for a fantastic evening. Next week we have a session on Iran. So hope to see you then. Thank you.
Saba, can you point out?
Yes, the flyers for Tales of City by the Sea. This is flyers here, so please grab one.